Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. U.S. diplomatic bandwidth remains stretched. Senior U.S. envoys are still heavily engaged in Iran-related negotiations, while Ukraine and Russia continue escalating without a clearly expanded diplomatic framework. Kyiv is signaling quiet frustration that its engagement with Moscow is effectively filtered through a very small number of U.S. intermediaries. Moscow, interestingly, still seems to value those same channels, even as battlefield intensity increases. The end result is a kind of compressed diplomacy: high stakes, low capacity, and very little room for structural negotiation expansion. Now shift into the battlefield because the scale of what just hit Kyiv matters, but more for what it signals than just what it did. Russia launched a massive coordinated aerial strike against Ukraine's capital involving hundreds of drones and missiles across multiple categories. This wasn't a single wave of pressure. It was a layered system designed to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses through saturation, speed variation, and decoy integration. The impact on the ground was severe. Residential areas were hit. Civilian infrastructure was damaged. Medical and humanitarian supply sites were struck, including facilities tied to emergency aid distribution. Casualties were significant, with dozens killed and many more injured. But the more important layer is how the strike is evolving technically. Russian systems are increasingly blending faster drones with traditional cruise and ballistic missile profiles. Some of the unmanned systems involved are now reaching speeds that push them closer to cruise missile interception challenges than older drone defense models. At the same time, electronic warfare adjustments are forcing Ukraine into constant recalibration cycles just to keep interception rates stable. So the dynamic is no longer static offense versus static defense. It is adaptive offense versus adaptive defense, with both sides iterating in real time. Now zoom out, because Ukraine's response is not symmetric. It is strategic disruption. Ukraine has continued expanding its deep strike campaign into Russian territory and occupied zones, targeting energy infrastructure, refining capacity, logistics nodes, and power systems. These are not symbolic strikes. They are aimed at structural pressure points inside Russia's war economy. And you can see the effects showing up in uncomfortable places for Moscow. Russia is now dealing with fuel supply stress that is forcing it into unusual logistics behavior. Reports indicate preparations to import jet fuel through complex, multi-stage shipping routes involving third countries and ship-to-ship transfers. That matters because Russia is a major energy exporter. When an exporter begins importing refined fuel to stabilize domestic needs, it signals a mismatch between production capacity and consumption demands under stress conditions. This is where Ukraine's strategy becomes clearer. It is not about volume alone. It is about forcing fragmentation in Russia's downstream systems. Crimea is another pressure node in that same system. Ukrainian strikes on the peninsula are increasingly focused on infrastructure that supports both civilian life and military logistics. Electricity, fuel distribution, transport links, and storage sites are all being pressured. The result is growing disruption to daily life, including rationing and outages in key areas. Crimea is not just a geographic target. It is a political asset for Moscow. So every disruption there carries both operational and psychological weight. It forces Russia to spend resources protecting and sustaining a region that also serves as a symbolic anchor for the entire war narrative. Now move to the wider European theater, because this is where the conflict expands into something closer to a hybrid contest. There is growing concern among European defense analysts about suspected Russian use of maritime shadow fleet vessels as platforms for drone-related activity and surveillance. These are commercial-looking ships operating under obscured ownership structures and frequently disabling tracking systems. The pattern being observed is not random. Drones and surveillance activity have been linked in proximity to sensitive infrastructure across NATO countries, including air bases, ports, and even sites connected to nuclear deterrence infrastructure. The purpose appears less about direct attack and more about mapping, probing, and testing response times. Think of it as persistent reconnaissance pressure applied across multiple countries at once. Not a single incident, but a distributed campaign. Europe's response has been increasing maritime enforcement actions, including inspections and seizures of suspected vessels. But the scale of the shipping ecosystem involved makes attribution and control difficult, which is part of the strategic design. Now pull back inside Russia, because internal pressure is building in parallel with external pressure. The political calendar is moving toward nationwide elections in September, with the ruling party still expected to dominate. But beneath that surface stability, there are signs of strain. Approval ratings are softening. Economic pressure linked to war spending is accumulating, and the state is increasingly relying on managed turnout systems and controlled electoral mechanisms to maintain outcomes. At the same time, internal security pressure is increasing. There are multiple reported cases involving extremism charges tied to online speech, recruitment criticism, or commentary on mobilization practices. There are also fraud and corruption investigations tied to military-linked organizations and recruitment networks. Even more sensitive are cases involving private military structures and recruitment exploitation, which suggests stress in parts of the system responsible for sustaining manpower flows into the war. None of this indicates systemic collapse, but it does indicate a system under sustained operational load, increasingly reliant on enforcement mechanisms to manage internal friction. And there is a parallel narrative developing outside the immediate war zone that matters for long-term positioning. Russia is actively trying to convert critical minerals and resource diplomacy into geopolitical leverage. The approach being pursued involves offering access to rare earth deposits, lithium projects, and upstream resource partnerships in countries across the global south, including India, Brazil, and Bolivia. The logic is straightforward. Use resource access as a diplomatic tool in a world where industrial supply chains are becoming geopolitical assets. But there is a constraint. Russia does not control the midstream processing ecosystems or the technological depth that makes those resources strategically dominant in global markets. That limits how far this strategy can go, at least in the short term. So what you are seeing is a system trying to compensate for pressure in one domain by expanding influence in another. And finally, there is a broader structural theme connecting everything here. This is no longer a war that can be understood purely through front lines in Ukraine. It is a system-wide contest that now includes energy flows, industrial capacity, maritime surveillance, domestic political stability, and alliance cohesion across Europe and the US. Ukraine is trying to turn Russian depth into vulnerability. Russia is trying to turn Ukrainian endurance into exhaustion. Europe is trying to harden its perimeter against hybrid pressure, and US diplomacy is trying to keep pace with a system that is moving faster than the structures designed to manage it. Thanks for listening. If you value clear, consistent analysis, leaving a review or a comment helps others discover the show. We also publish a daily intel brief on Substack, restrictedhandling.substack.com, offering deeper coverage on Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Appreciate your time. Have a great day.